And with me tonight, we have our moderator for this discussion, Mark Robinson. And Mark Robinson is a cartoonist. He worked for many years at Borders Bookstore as a storyteller, and he's a wonderful storyteller and a specialist in children's literature. And our guest tonight is Elizabeth Zunon. And it has been my great pleasure to get to know Elizabeth through her Cabo winners. One Plastic Bag, which was authored by Miranda Paul, and The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind by William Kamkwamba. By the way, she is a wonderful presenter. If you are looking for an author to come to your school and mesmerize your students, then Liz is the person for you. Before we get started though, let me just tell you a little about the Global Reads webinar series. So once a month, the World Area Book Awards will sponsor a 60-minute webinar on a book recognized by one of the awards or on the short list. As Liz, you know, I don't know if you know it, but your new book is on our short list.
Oh, very nice.
And just to let you know what the awards are, there's the Americas Award, the Children's Africana Book Award, the Freeman Book Award, the Middle East Book Award, and the South Asia Book Award. Each webinar will feature a presentation by award-winning author, as we have Liz tonight, with a discussion on how to incorporate multicultural literature into the classroom. We hope that you will read along with us this spring as we explore the world through these award-winning books. And we encourage all readers to join the conversation each month and ask the author your own questions. All sessions are free and open to the public, and all are listed on Eastern Standard Time. The list, we're sort of kicking off this global webinar series this year with the Children's Africana Book Awards, and the next one will be on March 18th. And you can actually go online, and you probably have already done this and you've seen what the list would be. I also want to thank, we have some technical support in the background. One is Vanessa Oyugi, who is also the co-outreach coordinator at Howard University, and Denise Walterine Vargas, who is the outreach director at Tulane University Center for Latin American Studies. So I think right now we are just going to jump right in, and Liz will start sharing her presentation, and then afterwards, then Mark is going to kick off the questions. So Liz.
All right, thank you very much, Brenda. I'm happy to be here with you tonight and sharing a little bit about my process as an illustrator and as an author for the very first time. I'm going to start with my book, Grandpa Cacao, A Tale of Chocolate from Farm to Family. It's really a book about art imitating life, and I love those kinds of books that look at important things in our lives and kind of put them on a different platform or a grander stage. So this book, Grandpa Cacao, tells the story of my grandfather in the Ivory Coast, my real-life grandfather, although he is my grandfather that I never actually met in real life. So this story, this picture book, children's picture book, is inspired by my father's stories. I was born in Albany, New York, which is where I live now, but I grew up in the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, West Africa, which is where my father's from. And the Ivory Coast is the world's #1 exporter of cacao and coffee, and cacao is what is used, the fruit that is used to make chocolate. So cacao and chocolate are a big point of pride for all Ivorians. So growing up, I ate a lot of chocolate, and I heard a lot of stories about my grandfather, my father's father, who was a cacao farmer. So in this picture book, I'm bringing together family, I'm bringing together what it's like to live on a cacao plantation, and most especially our family's love of chocolate. So in the book, a little girl and her dad bake a chocolate cake while she learns about her grandfather. And as they add the different ingredients into the bowl to make their chocolate cake, the dad is telling the little girl about a different step that Grandpa did back on the farm in Africa to prepare these cacao fruits so that they could have the fruits, the chocolate to make this chocolate cake. So although this book was published in May of 2019, it's actually stemmed from an idea that I had in art school many, many years ago. And it's gone through a lot of transformation in the past about 14 years. The first iteration of this book was actually in one of my illustration classes at the Rhode Island School of Design. And we were tasked with creating a star book, kind of like a pop-up book, inspired by an interview. So I interviewed my father about his childhood living in the Ivory Coast. My childhood in the Ivory Coast was very urban and suburban. My father's childhood in the Ivory Coast was very rural. He lived near a farm in a village. And that's something from African life that I've never experienced for myself. So I created this artist book, this pop-up book, with 5 different scenes from my father's childhood. And the scene that stuck the most with me was the scene of my father and his brother and his mother walking through a cacao plantation. So that's the image that you see in the center of your screen there. So my other cacao or chocolate themed projects from being a student at the Rhode Island School of Design consisted of making cacao pods out of ceramics. I was not very good at ceramics, but I was obsessed with the shape of the cacao pod and the fruits. I did a lot of illustration work related to the history of cacao and chocolate. And even in my, my sewing class, I made a cacao tree with hanging cacao fruit pods out of fabric and paper. So coming back to how to actually write a picture book, thinking about what should I write about? I asked myself, I love learning about processes. I would love to write a book about how something is made, how chocolate is made. But how can I write about something, a process, without sounding boring? Talking about all of the steps can be very repetitive. So I thought I could break it up with other actions. So the activity of the girl and her father in the current day, putting the ingredients together to make a chocolate cake, can reflect the process that Grandpa does on the farm to harvest the cacao fruits, and also break up kind of what might be monotonous about the life of a farmer, cutting down the fruits, opening them up, scooping out the beans, and everything like that that he does. So when I was actually able to sell my Grandpa Cacao manuscript, I had a lot of help from my agent, Lori, and the editor, Mary Kate at Bloomsbury, who really helped me streamline the text. I usually like to write very long sentences with fanciful words and a lot of punctuation. I love semicolons, but I had to really hone in on how to tell the story with the least amount of words possible, especially since it's kind of a long story. There's a lot of process and action and activity in the book. They really helped me to streamline the text and make the events in the book seem interesting for a very young reader. So I was writing with active tense, telling the story of Grandpa Cacao as he's existing in the past as a memory, but trying not to make the memory of him sound boring or passive or unimportant. And then another thing that I honed in on was eliminating phrases in the text that actually describe the art, instead focusing on the sound and the shape of the words when read aloud. And it's obviously one thing to read a book to yourself in your head, but I've learned by doing a lot of presentations, including story time, reading books aloud to children, that the sound and the shape of the words really makes an impact when you're trying to tell the story in your voice. So here's an example of some of the text changes that I made. So the old version says, "We're from a land called the Ivory Coast," Daddy answers, "where big, graceful elephants used to roam, where the air is hot and damp and thick with stories and music and languages of people from tiny villages to big cities." So I made a couple of the changes that I referred to just a minute ago, changing it from the old version to now the new. "We're from a land called the Ivory Coast," Daddy says, "where I grew up watching big, graceful elephants roam. It's where the air breathes hot and damp, rather than the air is hot and damp." Breathing has much more vitality in that word than just the word is hot and damp. "Thick with stories and music and the languages of people from tiny villages and big cities." Oh, and the example of removing text that actually describes the art. Here we see Grandpa. He is plucking one of the ripe fruits, one of the ripe orange fruits from the tree. And here we see him hacking through the bush on the way to the plantation, reaching up into the tree with a long stick of wood and cutting down the cacao pods that are up on the branches, and then using his machete to actually cut open the cacao pod to get at the fruits inside. So the old version of the text that accompanied those images said, "In the forest canopy of green, your Grandpa Cacao kept his eyes peeled for orange and yellow fruits. He picked only the ripe cacao fruits ready to be harvested. He cut the cacao pods right off of the tree trunks quickly and precisely, and used a long stick to reach the ones high up on tall branches." So those are two complicated and long and wordy sentences. So the editing of those sentences became, "Your Grandpa Cacao spotted the ripe fruits ready to be picked from the forest canopy and cut them right off of the tree trunks quickly and precisely." So we've gotten rid of the color of the green forest canopy. We've gotten rid of the color of the orange and yellow ripe fruits. We've gotten rid of the description of the long stick to cut down the fruits because we see all those things in the illustration. So there's no need to re-mention them in the text. So I knew that I wanted to use oil paint and collage. Those are my two main primary media when I'm illustrating a picture book. And I knew that I also wanted to use silk screening for the first time in a book. I've silk screened a lot of t-shirts and tote bags and pieces of fabric to make quilts, but I've never actually used silk screening or screen printing flat images into the illustrations in my book. So that was kind of a test for myself to see how I could implement a new art form into a style that I had been using for a while. Another question that I asked myself was, how can I illustrate the past and the present on the same page without being confusing? We're talking about the little girl and her dad baking a chocolate cake in the current day, but on the same page, we're also talking about Grandpa back on the farm as a younger man doing all the work to harvest the cacao fruits. So I decided it would be a good idea to create a visual language that the reader or the viewer can understand. So my creative process had a lot of different elements kind of feeding into each other. So my creative process starts with the memory, the vision, or the character that informs the story. The story informs the visual language, and the visual language informs writing with visual cues. So I'm always jumping back and forth between the writing and the illustrating when I'm tasked to do both of those things rather than just illustrate a text that someone else has written. So to display this kind of equation of my creative process here, I've got the memory, vision, or the character is what this whole thing started with. It all started with my father's memory or vision of walking through a field of cacao trees with his family. So that informed the story. The story is what the book is going to actually be about. What's going to grab the reader? What can they identify with? A child in the United States might not be able to identify with walking through a farm and harvesting fruits, but an American child, and probably children all over the world, can identify with cooking or baking or making a favorite dish with a family member. So the story became the girl and the father bake a chocolate cake while learning about what Grandpa Cacao did to prepare the fruits for chocolate making. So that story then informs the visual language, meaning how am I actually going to show all of this on the page? I'm going to use paint and collage for the story of the present day girl and her father baking the chocolate cake. And I'm going to create the figure of the grandfather as a ghostly white, kind of like a memory, a screen printed image. And I decided that this would be a good way to portray him because in real life, I've never met my grandfather. I don't even know what he looks like. So he's always been this mythical figure in my mind. So I always envision him as larger than life and kind of bigger than life and superhuman. So that's why I chose to depict him in this book as someone that's realistic, but also not quite realistic. So the visual language of my paint and my collage and my screen print also feeds into my writing with visual cues. I'm creating visual art, which means I have to look at visual things to be inspired to create the artwork and also create the text. So my writing with visual cues becomes images and objects that basically just cheer me on as I'm writing. I feel like if I can have a couple of elements that are important to the story sitting on my desk in front of me as I'm writing or sketching, I feel like all I have to do is kind of suck the story out of those elements, like those elements that are related to the story are imbued with the story itself. So it really helps me with writing to have something visual to look at. And of course, I'm writing about chocolate and cacao. I was eating a lot of chocolate when I was working on the writing and the illustrating of this book. So my creative process is really weaving different worlds together into a story, or combining different ingredients together into a recipe or a chocolate cake in this case. As I said, I need to eat a lot of chocolate when I'm writing and drawing and illustrating a book about chocolate and where chocolate comes from. So I always have a huge stash of chocolate in various parts of the house. So here's one of my stashes when I was beginning my work. So after editing the text and the sketch for each page and getting all of those changes approved by the editor and the art director, then I'm finally ready for painting. Adding color, mixing paint is my absolute favorite thing to do. And it really helps make the story come to life when I'm able to add color, especially add faces, add portraits to a story. And every illustration that I create comes from real life. I often use myself as a model for the characters in the books. I take photographs of myself acting out what happens on every single page of the book. I look at the photo of myself pretending to be that particular character, and I look at my reference photo of myself playing dress up, being that character, as reference when I'm drawing the character and then painting the character. So it always helps me, once again, to have a visual cue or a visual element to look at, to copy, to make sure, for example, the arms and legs are in the correct position or the correct length. So I use a lot of photographs when I'm painting. Here are some photographs that I used in this book, Grandpa Cacao. Portraits of my father, my mom and dad together, me and my little brother sitting on my mom's lap on the right there. And here is a photograph of two of the actual farmers on my father's plantation in the Ivory Coast. I've never met these gentlemen, and I've never actually been to my father's farm, but these are two of the guys that do the work that Grandpa Cacao does in this book. So it's great to kind of connect faces to activities and actions that I'm imagining about and then researching and then writing about. As I said, I use myself as a model to get the body proportions and the body positioning right. But I'm also using myself as a model to see where the light and the shadows fall on my skin tone. So here I am pretending to be the dad in the book, really my dad, at the beginning of the story when he is handing the little girl a bar of chocolate. Here's the drawing that I did based on that photograph of my dad that you saw earlier, and then also looking at where the highlights and the shadows are falling on my face here in the picture. And then I finished by adding the darker tones, his hair, eyebrows, and the background. And then here we can see the completed illustration where the oil paint and the cut paper collage elements are all completed together in the final illustration. I add a lot of different Easter eggs and secrets in all of my illustrations in all of my books. So here, the painting that is hanging behind my dad's head in this illustration is actually copied from the skyline of the city that I grew up in the Ivory Coast, Abidjan, which is the economic capital of the Ivory Coast, the biggest city. So that's just a nod to my hometown there and my background of my illustration. So here we have the sketch of the little girl, or the young me, reaching for that chocolate bar that her dad is handing her across the table. here I am imitating what she's doing, and I'm looking at my body positioning and also the highlights on my forehead, my cheek, my nose, my arms, my hands, so that I can paint those things realistically in the illustration. As I said, everything comes from life. Here's a photograph of my mom and dad's dining room, which is what I basically copied to create the dining room in the book. We see artwork on the wall, wooden table, wooden chair, and a window with the lace curtains in the background. So when I say every single element comes from real life, every single element comes from real life. Even the surface of the tabletop here in the illustration comes from my parents' actual dinner table that I photographed, printed out the photograph, and glued that printout of the photograph of my parents' wooden tabletop surface and glued that onto the illustration. And then in my own living room, I photographed all the ingredients to make that chocolate cake. And I copied the shapes of my Pyrex measuring cup, my bowls, my wooden spoons, container of sugar and salt and milk and flour, and added all of those actual things in paper form onto the final art, the final illustrations. And then also, the little girl and her dad are wearing aprons made up of patchwork, a patchwork of African fabrics, and every single piece of square or rectangle fabric in their aprons comes from an actual piece of clothing that I have from my childhood in the Ivory Coast. So either a pair of pants or a shirt or a large tabletop or tablecloth or piece of fabric that we often use for shawls or headscarves. I'm photographing cake elements. I'm photographing hands holding bowls, cracking eggs open, and also photographing what my final chocolate cake is going to look like. I love drawing and painting hands and feet, and it's so much easier to look at a real hand performing an action rather than trying to imagine what a hand looks like when a hand is reaching for an egg or holding 3 eggs. So I'm always painting, and when my paint is dry, because I use oil paint, which takes a while to dry, once that is dry, everything that I've not painted, I add in collage. Also chocolate. I've got to stay inspired, writing a book about chocolate, keep eating chocolate and dipping into my chocolate stash. Here I am, not really using my imagination because I'm actually opening a bar of chocolate and smelling that wonderful, deep, luscious cacao smell. There's the beginning of the illustration from the book, inspired by that photograph. And here's the final illustration with all of the paint elements painted and all of the cut paper collage elements cut and glued onto the painting. I like to start with painting the faces on each page, and then I'll paint the sky and the ground and maybe a couple of background elements. And then here you can see my desk as I'm starting to cut with my little nail scissors and my craft scissors, the little squares that will become the patchwork of each of their aprons here in this illustration. I usually like to work on about 4 paintings or illustrations all at once. So I'll paint the faces and the sky and the ground in 4 usually consecutive illustrations. And then I'll go about finding what papers I'm going to use for the collage elements in each of those illustrations. So here is an illustration in process with my paint. And then I trace out the shapes that I have not painted so that I know what I'm going to cut out of my paper. Cutting my paper, gluing it onto my illustration, and then adding all those tiny different patchwork elements into the illustration as well. And also always looking at my sketch for reference, and always looking at photographs that I took for reference as well. So I really get lost in the tiny little details of the style of the door, the doormat, the frames of the photographs on the wall, the handle of the door. I really get lost in finding the perfect piece of paper to make all of these different elements look realistic. And of course, just like everything else in the book, this particular scene when Grandpa shows up at the door is inspired by my actual parents' living room. They have blue walls, they have a blue doormat, they have a photograph from their wedding day on the left, you see there, and then on the right you can see one of the paintings that I painted when I was a student in college as well. So I'm copying everything that I see. Since the story is inspired by real life, I'm looking at the elements of real life and trying to imitate them in picture book form. Here we can see a close-up of my parents' wedding picture there. And then on the right, we can see I've asked my little brother to pose for me. He is featured in the book. He's the little boy that is the very picky eater. And he's now a grown-up man who's very tall and bearded and not that tiny little boy anymore. But here he is helping me out, posing, pretending to be our grandfather at the door so that I have a good reference image to work at when I'm painting. As I said, I never met my grandfather from the Ivory Coast in real life. I've never seen a photograph of him. So I looked at my face, my father's face, my brother's face, my cousin's faces to try to figure out what he might look like. So primarily, I was looking at my face. I was posing as him, trying to pretend what he might feel like if he were in these particular situations. I sketched his face. I painted the outline of the face on my final illustration. I added the skin color, the midtones, and then the highlights. Close-ups of his hands holding the cacao fruit when he shows up at the door. In the original version of this, Grandpa had a beard, and then we decided to remove his beard. So he looks a little bit more youthful, I think, here in the final version with no facial hair. So the last thing I add are shadows and hair to make him kind of jump off the page and come alive. So another problem that I had to solve was, what would Grandpa Cacao wear? He probably would not wear jeans and a t-shirt, but I knew that a lot of elderly men in the villages in the Ivory Coast wore pants and button-down shirts, but then on top they would wear a piece of fabric wrapped around their waist and then thrown over their shoulder. Here we see more examples of that. Especially the village chiefs would wear really fanciful fabric over their shoulders. So I thought, I'm gonna give my grandpa the same kind of outfit that maybe a village chief might wear. He was not a village chief in real life, but he was one of the elders, respected elders in the village. So I found a stash of fabric from my childhood in the Ivory Coast in a bin in my closet, and I went through it and found the perfect piece of fabric for Grandpa Cacao's shawl. So first I drew out the shapes of his shawl with my pencil on my tracing paper, and then cut out my photograph of that fabric and glued those pieces onto the final illustration. So after painting each of these illustration spreads, these double pages in the book, came creating the silk screens. Now this was the thing that I was most stressed out about, because it was my first time making silk screens for a book. But it's kind of a drawn out process, but you have to basically make stencils on big frames of silk. So here I am making my screen prints or my stencils with my screen filler paint, painting a couple of different layers, letting them dry, and then pushing my screen printing ink through my prints or my stencil so that I can have these white figures that I've screen printed onto my full color painted illustrations. So I got full color prints made of my illustrations so that if I messed up screen printing or producing the stencil on one element of the illustration, I would have a backup version. So I was silk screening on my computer prints of the illustration. I was silk screening on the original oil paint and collage pieces, and then choosing which one came out better. trying to compare, okay, well, does the screen print look best on the original painting, or does it look best on a printout of the painting? Here we have some of the reference pictures that I was looking at, showing the cacao farmers on the bottom left as they are drying the cacao beans out in the sun, as they're weighing them in huge scales, on huge scales. And once again, chocolate cake research and development. I'm writing a book about chocolate, how to make a chocolate cake. At the end of the book, there's a recipe for my chocolate cake. So I've got to get the best ingredients and the best amounts of ingredients together to make this chocolate cake. So I'm melting chocolate and butter, adding my flour and sugar and eggs, all the while taking reference photos of all of these different steps of what it takes to bake a chocolate cake. And then looking at those reference photos to paint and collage the illustrations in the book. As I said, everything comes from real life. Here, I stuck my camera in the oven while the oven was off, took a photograph of my face, pretending to be amazed at that beautiful chocolate cake rising, and used that photo of myself pretending to look at that cake as reference to paint the little girl's face looking at the cake actually through the oven door. Here I am collaging the pieces of paper that make up the interior of the oven for the illustration, and then taste tests. This one has too much baking powder, that one doesn't quite taste right. And then after many, many, many tries, way more than just 3, I think I found the best combination of ingredients for my special celebration cake, chocolate cake. So in spring 2019, it was published, Grandpa Cacao, A Tale of Chocolate from Farm to Family, published by Bloomsbury Books. And it's basically our chocolate family story. And it's a love letter to the chocolate that I love and the grandfather that I never met. All right, now I'm going to move on and talk about another book inspired by real life. One Plastic Bag, Aissatou Ceesay and the Recycling Women of the Gambia. This is written by Miranda Paul, and I did the illustrations for this. And it's a true story about a girl in recycling. Aissatou Ceesay lives in the Gambia, West Africa. This is a beautiful portrait of her. And I always like to show a map, especially when I do presentations for younger kids. Aissatou lives in a very skinny country called the Gambia. It is in West Africa. It's not too far from the Ivory Coast where I lived. Let's see, I lived right here in the Ivory Coast. So that's one thing that the subject of this book and I have in common. Now, when I was working on this book, One Plastic Bag, I did not meet Aissatou. I did not travel to Gambia. So when I read a story or illustrate a story about somebody that I've never met, I always ask myself, what are the things that we have in common? And what are the things that we might be able to talk about if we ever did meet in real life? So the fact that we both lived in West Africa, and Aissatou still lives in West Africa, is one thing that we have in common. So having never met her or spoken to her while working on this book, I worked from a lot of reference photographs from the author, Miranda Paul, and I also did a lot of playing dress up and pretending that I was the character, Aissatou, in the book. And I took a lot of pictures of myself pretending to be the girl in the book and acting out everything that she does in the story. Not only for my art reference images, but just for myself as an isolated person, working by myself in my studio, trying to put myself in the shoes of the people whose lives I'm actually trying to bring to life. So I use a lot of photographs from the author, Miranda Paul, who has visited Aissatou in her village in Njau, Gambia, and learned about the recycling project that Aissatou has created, and everything that she's done to empower the women and the men as well in her village. So to illustrate this book, first I received the text, and then I drew a pencil sketch for every single page, trying to figure out what I should show on each illustration. And then I started to paint. Just like in Grandpa Cacao, I'm looking at pictures of real people Here's a photograph of the real Aissatou Cissé on the left. And I'm looking at pictures of myself acting out the roles that those characters do on the page. In this illustration, I'm trying to figure out what paper to use for Aissatou's dress in the image. So in a lot of the reference pictures that I received from Miranda Paul, the author, Aissatou is wearing pink or purple. So I decided, okay, I think if I ever met Aissatou in real life, I think she would like this patterned pink and purple paper that I used for her dress. So I cut out the shape of her dress, or her mbuba, cut it and glued it onto my illustration. And that's what really, I think, helps the illustration come to life. Well, once I've added that collage element. Here we can see Aissatou's grandmother Mbombe in the photograph on the left, seated next to the author, Miranda Paul. So Aissatou's grandmother features very much in the story. So I looked at what grandmother is wearing in this photograph, and I tried to go through my collection of papers and find a pattern and a color that I think grandmother might like in real life. So that's what I gave her in the illustration. Here I am acting out the plot in the book. Aissatou here is picking up her papers from the ground and putting them in a plastic bag. Aissatou's walking past piles and piles of dirty trash mixed in with smelly plastic bags. And I'm looking at pictures of my own feet walking, and I'm looking at pictures of Aissatou herself with her little baby Noah on her back. And I'm copying those photographs when I'm painting those same elements in the book. And in the story, Aissatou and her friends collect all of the dirty plastic bags that are polluting the village. They wash them in soap and water, bring them home, and crochet them. So I don't know how to crochet, nor do I know how to knit, but I watched a couple of videos of Aissatou actually crocheting and figured out in what position my hands would need to be to look like my hands are actually crocheting the same way that Aissatou is. In the story, they do this by candlelight at night when everyone else is asleep. So I waited till nighttime, lit some candles in my living room, and took photographs of myself pretending to crochet by candlelight as the ladies do in the book. At the end of the book, they've made a bunch of crocheted purses, recycled purses. Aissatou brings them to the market and tries to sell them. This is another thing that Aissatou and I have in common. I don't knit, I don't crochet, but I do make purses, and I silkscreen t-shirts, and I make jewelry, and I used to sell all these things at craft fairs. So here's a photograph of myself and my friend Maddie at a craft fair here in Albany, New York. And so I thought that's another thing that Aissatou and I have in common. We've both lived in West Africa, and we both love to craft. And those are two really important things I think we might be able to talk about if we ever meet in real life. So here we can see at the top the photograph of a bunch of Aissatou and her friends' crocheted purses sitting on the table. And then on the bottom, the illustration that I created inspired by those pieces that they created. On the last page in the book, all of the dirty piles of trash are gone. There are no plastic bags littering the sidewalks, hanging from tree branches, and the goats and all the animals are healthy again because they're not choking on the plastic bags that are mixed in with the trash that they're digging through. This is the illustration that I created based on all of those facts and based on these photographs. Aissatou and little baby Noah, who's now grown up into a little boy, 7-year-old boy. They've got a healthy neighborhood, healthy goats, and they've even started a neighborhood community garden. So she is so inspiring. Aissatou not only created a way for her and her friends to make money and earn an income and support their families in a financial way, but they also really educated the public about recycling. And thanks to Aissatou, actually the Gambia, I believe, is the first African country to outlaw plastic bags. So I think we all need to kind of take her example and be really creative with what we do with our trash. I like to use Aissatou's story when I visit classrooms And there's a lot of projects that I like to do using strips of plastic, also pieces of yogurt cups and cardboard. So if you take 3 strips of plastic and braid them together, you can make jewelry. You can tie them in knots and make kind of plastic beads. You can weave them. You can make plastic bag flowers. You can make a basketball net using a scoop, a piece of plastic from a sliced up empty yogurt cup and strips of plastic tied around the yogurt cup into knots as a basketball net. And the possibilities are really endless with what we can make with our trash or our recyclables. So lastly, I will just jump into The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, another true story about an amazingly inspiring person, written by William Kamkwamba and Brian Mueller. You probably already know this story, or maybe you've seen a Netflix film about William's achievements. William is from Malawi, East Africa, somewhere I've never been either. I had to do a lot of research to see what life was like there. He lives in a farm village where he and his family grow corn. One year, a drought dries up all of their cornfields. They no longer have money for William to go to school, so he drops out, ends up at the library, finds a science textbook called Using Energy, sees the windmills on the covers, sees diagrams of how a windmill works, and decides he's going to make one out of the trash, the pieces of trash at the junkyard. So as with every other story that I illustrate, I read the story, I take notes, I make little doodles, I ask myself questions. I have to figure out what are the characters going to look like, where's the story taking place, how should they be dressed, what do I need to understand so that I could illustrate this book correctly or realistically. I doodle, I draw, I create storyboards. Often I will map out the entire book on one sheet of 18-inch by 24-inch paper. I'll draw little rectangles for every double spread, double page in the book, and basically draw almost like stick figures and just general simple shapes to help me figure out what characters and what things I'm going to show in each image. It's basically the same thing as mapping out a movie or a TV show, figuring out the scenes. Am I going to be zoomed out? Am I going to be zoomed in? What do I need to show? What are the characters? What are the props? What are the costumes? And then research. I've never lived in Malawi. I've never built a windmill. So I've got to get a general idea of what these things, how these things function and what they are like. I take a lot of pictures. And then I create a drawing for every page in the book, just like I did for my previous books. And then painting, which is my favorite part, followed by collage, the second best part. Here we see a sketch and then the final art with the paint and the cut paper pieces. Here we see the sketch and the final art with the paint, the cut paper pieces, and then the text, the words that are digitally added by the publisher. Here we see the sketch, the final art. William's neighbors are calling him crazy and dirty as I see him bringing home pieces of trash from the junkyard. And as he's cobbling all these pieces together, I'm thinking I should use some of the same things that he uses to make his windmill in making my art. So I used photographs of crushed bottle caps that I found at home. I used a photograph of a light bulb from my studio, and I used photographs of nuts and bolts and screws because those are what he uses in his book, in his story, to create his windmill. So if you look closely, you can see photograph of my light bulb, photograph of my screws over here, and my crushed up bottle caps in the bottom left there. I wanted to be just like William in the story. I've never met him. I've never done the amazing things that he's done, but my body can imitate the things that his body does in the book. So here I am pretending to turn on a light bulb and yelling Tonga, which means I did it in his African Chichewa language. Look at those photographs for the sketch, and then look at those photographs for the final art. At the end of the book, William is standing on the steps that lead up to his windmill, looking really proud over his family and his neighbors, and everybody is clapping and cheering for him. Well, through my research, I found that William has a mother and a father, 2 cousins, and 6 sisters. So luckily, William's co-author, Brian Mueller, emailed me photographs of all of the family members so that I could paint them realistically, draw them first, and then paint them realistically in the book. So I was hoping that if every single sister can pick herself out of this illustration, then I'm successful in telling the story. So William's windmills are super inspiring. Here are some of the ones that he built, the first ones that he built right around his house in Malawi. Oh, and I'll just finish with the cover. When I was starting out, the cover was the very last thing that I did after all of the illustrations. So I started out with a sketch, trying to figure out where are the words going to go on the cover? Where's the character going to go? What position should the character be? Should they be full body? Should they be just a head or head and shoulders? I choose the best sketch and then create the final art for the cover, and then I'm done. So I think I'm all out of time here. Thank you very much for signing in and listening to me talk about my art and illustration and writing process.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was just wonderful. I had no idea all this hard work that you do to make things so, so authentic. So very appreciative. And I'm going to turn this over now to Mark, who's going to ask a few questions. And we also want to invite the people who have been listening that they can click on their chat box and they can type in a question. So Mark.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Robinson, and I want to thank you, Ms. Zunon, for your presentation. It was wonderful. And
my pleasure.
Learned a lot. Also, thank you for creating a book dedicated to chocolate. I really appreciate that. I also want to ask you, I realized that you basically have been working on different versions of this book over like 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering, how long did the process of creating this final version of the book take, would you think?
This final version, I would say, took about 1.5 years. Usually when I'm illustrating a book solely and not writing, usually it takes me about 9 months. But for this one, when I was writing and illustrating, I'd say about 1.5 years from beginning to start, editing all of the text and then editing all of the sketches, submitting both of those for approval, and then creating all of the final art.
Okay. I know that in the book you said that you had not had the opportunity to visit a real cacao plantation. Is that still the same? Have you not yet had the opportunity?
Yes, unfortunately, that's still true. I have not yet been to a real cacao farm. I left the Ivory Coast right before I turned 13 in 1997. So it's been 22 plus years now. And we have not been back just because the political situation has been very up and down. When I was a kid, we lived in a big bustling city, and although I knew that my grandfather and my dad had plantations, when I was a kid, my grandfather had already passed away. But I knew about the history of cacao in our family, but I was never taken to the farm or the plantation, and I never asked to be. I think the older that I got, especially when I was a college student, feeling really nostalgic about having lived in the Ivory Coast and missing my life there, I think that's when I really became interested in cacao and farming and chocolate. And that's when I actually started doing more research to learn about what that all entails. When I was a kid, I didn't care. I just ate chocolate.
Okay. Brenda Randolph is asking, how has your family reacted to the book Grandpa Cacao?
Oh, they're very proud. Yeah, I live 10 minutes from my parents here now in Albany, and they come to every local book signing and book reading. I just had one last Saturday at a local library, and my parents, my crew were there cheering me on. I think parents are always kind of scared when their kids want to become artists or writers or creative people that don't have you know, a steady paycheck and health insurance and all those things. So I think they're relieved in a way to see that I've been able to create a career using what I'm passionate about, and especially telling our family story.
Okay. Another person has logged on. They're saying that they want to thank you for your presentation and creating your book. In 2002 in West Africa, it was reported that children were victims of forced labor and human trafficking in the cocoa industry, which you allude to at the end of the book. What is your take in this matter regarding children trafficking for the cocoa industry? And I also wanted to thank you, she says, for using the term free trade in the book. It gives me the idea that you are aware, of course, of the forced labor.
Yeah, exactly. Well, obviously, children working is something that I'm against. It is a huge problem in many countries that provide fruits and farmed things. Especially in the Ivory Coast, there's been a lot of reporting and writing done about children that are working on these farms. Obviously, I'm not condoning that. I think we need to remember that the farmers that grow cacao are the poorest of the poor farmers. Even though the chocolate that we buy is beautiful and sexy and refined and luscious, most of the farmers that grow the fruit that turn into chocolate cannot afford to buy a chocolate bar. And most of those farmers are not only poor farmers, but they're below the poverty level in their own countries. So we might think of them as poor because we might think of a farmer in a developing country as poor, but they are the poorest of the poor even where they live. So people who are in those dire situations, they find ways to get the work done that is not always on the up and up. And there are a lot of families that come from the neighboring countries around the Ivory Coast looking for work. And if you're sick and you might have to send your kid out to look for a job, your kid might end up out on a plantation. You never know. I don't know. It's a huge problem, and that's why I try to promote fair trade whenever I'm talking about chocolate or giving chocolate away. But I do need to, I like to remind people that most of the chocolate that we eat that is manufactured by huge companies that is not certified fair trade, those are the companies that cannot certify that their chocolate, their cacao does not come from farms that use child labor. So a lot of the fair trade chocolates chocolate companies work with cooperative farms or farms that they know the names of the farmers, they know the location of the farms, they know the working practices, the farming practices of all these participating farmers. The bigger companies often don't even know where their cacao comes from, because the bigger companies might combine cacao from multiple farms, multiple countries even. So Hershey's might use cacao from the Ivory Coast and Costa Rica and Ecuador all together, because they want to make sure that their chocolate has a consistent flavor. So the best way that they can do that is use a bunch of different kinds mixed together. If they're depending on one crop from one farm, the taste might be different from year to year. So the big companies, although they cannot certify exactly which farms their cacao comes from, a lot of them have started implementing programs in the countries that provide their cacao to help the children of the cacao farmers and prevent those children from actually ending up working on the cacao farms. A lot of the big companies have started schools and cooperatives so that they can try to give the parents enough money selling the cacao so that the kids, they don't have to resort to sending their kids to work for the cacao farm as well. So there's just so many good and bad practices going on in the cacao industry, in the chocolate industry.
Okay, thank you for the information. That was something I learned from reading your book. I'm curious, you previously illustrated a children's book using two perspectives, poems in the attic. So I was wondering, how did that inform the creation of Grandpa Cacao, and how much experience did you have with silk screening prior to the creation of this book?
Yes. Well, for Poems in the Attic, it's funny, I find something to relate to in every single picture book that I illustrate. Poems in the Attic is about a young girl, a little girl that finds a box of poems in her grandmother's attic. And these poems were written by the girl's mother when the mother was a child and living on different Air Force bases around the world. So each page in the book takes place in a different place that her mother has lived as a child. So I really identified with this, not only in the little girl finding poems that her mother had written, but also identified with the mother having moved around multiple times during her childhood. So I think that was the first book where I really tried to tell two stories on one page together, and I kind of divided up the illustration. I think I on the left quarter of the double spread, I painted one scene, and then on the 3/4 of the remaining image, I painted another scene. So that was my first foray into trying to tell two stories, two separate stories on one page. Then with the silk screening, I had only silk screened for fun on t-shirts and tote bags and things to sell at craft fairs. But once I became obsessed with that shape of the cacao pod, and then once I was trying to solve that problem of how to show Grandpa Cacao as this otherworldly, mythical being, I decided I think silk screening is the way to solve that.
Okay. In your Amazon bio, I read that you revealed that you buy a new paintbrush and a new paint color that you've never used before. So I've got to ask, what new paint color did you choose for this project?
Ooh, the new paint color that I chose for Grandpa Cacao, I believe, was magenta. And magenta oil paint stains. So it stained my paintbrush, stained my fingers. But I don't think I had used magenta before in any other book. So it's just it's a little like a little treat for myself. New paintbrush, new color. Because I'm doing basically the same process every single book. So I need to make it exciting for myself sometimes.
Okay. I've got a question here. Again, they're thanking you for your presentation. She says, I appreciate you sharing your storytelling process with us and including us in the explanation of your vision. What other stories would you like to tell?
Ooh, good question. I would definitely like to continue to write and illustrate. I'm working on a story idea right now about salt. I love food. I love where things come from. So I'm working on a picture book about the trans-Saharan salt routes. I've seen images of camels with humongous blocks of salt attached on their backs, walking through the desert. So I'm working on developing a story about a little boy who goes on a salt caravan with his dad for the very first time through the Sahara Desert. So I'm really excited about where that's going to take me, and maybe I'll have a chance to travel and do some research for once instead of staying at home and researching through books and internet and videos. Yeah, I'd like the opportunity to travel to the places that I actually write and illustrate about.
Okay. Let's see. I've got a question here from a teacher asking any advice for teachers on how they might use your books in the classroom.
Great question. Yeah, I always like to, when I bring the books into the classroom, try to find an activity that can coordinate with the books, or even an idea. I often visit classrooms with the two books that I've illustrated that are about recycling, One Plastic Bag and The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, which I talked about. Many communities around the country and many schools have recycling systems set in place. So I love the idea of combining an idea like recycling with art or with science or the environment or math. So I like the idea of combining something that the kids are already familiar with or that they already know about, like recycling, and then trying to find projects that are inspired by the story or the people in the story using recycling and maybe other elements as well.
Okay. Another viewer is writing, I have to say that I got home late, so was watching the webinar at dinner. My husband and 3 kids in their late teens and 20s were engrossed and enthralled. You do
Oh,
art that speaks to people of all ages. Thank you.
oh, thank you. That's so nice to hear.
And another viewer wrote, fantastic and deeply meaningful presentation. Thank you. I will be using your book with a 3rd grade artist in residency in Maryland in the next few weeks. We will be studying
Awesome.
flowers from various areas in West Africa, and one of our choices will be the cacao plant and its flowers and fruit. We'll create large 3D flowers for an art installation in their new school opening in the fall. So thanks again for this wonderful resource, both the book and your presentation.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. That's very exciting to hear. Thank you very much. I hope you have fun making all those cacao pods and cacao flowers.
Oh, and Brenda, I believe there's a question here. Once again, they're saying, thank you for this most insightful and fascinating presentation. Your iterative, creative process is so mesmerizing and you produce such beauty, text and visual combined. Now, they would like to know, will this webinar be available for the public after tonight? I would like to share it widely with art educators. Thank you.
And that's a yes, because all of our webinars are archived and you can have access to them online.
Wonderful.
Okay,
So
it's
we
just
wanna-
come up right on the line there. Okay.
Right, thank you. Yeah, that's Denise working in the background. Yes, it will be, it will be you'll be able to share it, and she gives the link so that you can get to it. So I want to thank everybody tonight, those that you can see and those in the background that you can't see. And thank you, Liz, for a wonderful presentation. And I hope that you will tune in for our next webinar, which will be on the March the 18th. And this will be sponsored by the Middle East Outreach Council. So again, thanks to everyone and have a good night.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.